the U.S. Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling. This is no small thing, y'all. I mean, a landmark ruling that will dramatically change the way we do business in this country, the way we manage the environment, the way we talk about healthcare regulation. We have effectively undermined the federal government's ability to engage in regulatory actions. Let me be very specific and very clear. There was a ruling back in 1984, known as the Chevron decision, or known as Chevron. It is Chevron versus the Natural Resources Defense Council. Back then in 1984, by a vote of 6-3, the Supreme Court basically said that if there is an issue that Congress has not directly addressed, i.e., that means the law hasn't directly made this plain and clear, the federal government and federal agencies have the power to interpret the statute as long as it's reasonable. So in other words, if there is a dispute about what clean air means, or if there's a dispute about what a reasonable distance is, or there's a dispute about what a healthy person might be, I'm sort of pulling some things out here, but the idea here is that if there's an ambiguous law, if there's something that's unclear, that federal agencies have the ability to, and the right and the power to make a decision about that. Now, that has been doctrine, we call the Chevron doctrine, for more than 40 years. The Supreme Court has stood strong and tall on this principle. And the reason they've done that is because they believe, crazy enough, that we should appeal to expertise, that if there is a debate about how to interpret an educational policy, the Department of Education should deal with it. If there's a question about environmental issues, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, should deal with it. This was a very basic, reasonable, logical interpretation of how power should work between federal agencies versus the courts. But now, today, the Roberts Court has made its own interpretation. They have basically overturned and undone 40 years of legal doctrine. They've now ruled 6-3. You'll be shocked to know this was along ideological lines. The conservatives voted one way, the liberals voted the other way. They voted that the courts should make the determination, not the federal agencies. Whew. Now, what's interesting about the fact that the conservatives made this decision, the fact that the conservatives made this move, is that back in the day, the decision was applauded by conservatives. Back in 1984, the Chevron decision actually was used to uphold the Reagan administration. You know how conservative Reagan was, the Reagan administration's EPA, which made an interpretation about the Clean Air Act that actually made it easier to not regulate carbon emissions. In other words, there was a decision about, again, how much the environment should be regulated with regards to the two emissions. And they said, well, let's not ask the court, let's ask the Environmental Protection Agency. And in that case, it actually supported the conservatives' argument because it was Reagan's EPA. He had a bunch of people there that didn't care about the environment. But over time, conservatives have looked at this ruling and said, you know what? We don't want this much government. We don't want this much regulation. And so even the Roberts decision earlier today, they acknowledged that this used to be a conservative darling, but they said, not anymore. This has become unworkable. This doesn't make sense anymore. We can't work with this kind of a doctrine. And so it just doesn't make sense to us. And as a result, we're overturning it. And we're saying that the courts have the power to make these determinations. What a strange thing to do. Intellectually, it doesn't make sense. You're saying that effectively, the people who know the most about the environment, the EPA, shouldn't make the decision. Some random person, or not random, but a judge should make that determination. You're saying that the person who's the most about housing or transportation or education or healthcare shouldn't make the determination about those issues. A judge on a bench who doesn't have technical knowledge, who doesn't have expert knowledge, who doesn't have experience in that field, that they should somehow be the decider. That doesn't make sense. But it does make sense when you look at the fact that the Republican movement, the conservative movement, the right in general, has effectively tried to shave away all forms of federal oversight. Donald Trump just said the other night he wants to get rid of the Department of Education altogether. They don't want anything but a Department of Defense. They want to go to war. They want to manage the economy. They want to make sure billionaires are protected. And they want everything else to go to states. They want everything else to go to courts. And the fact that the Roberts Court is doing this is just another reminder of this court's legacy. The Roberts Court legacy, the Roberts Court's legacy will be stripping away women's rights, stripping away reproductive freedom, undoing all of the advances of the last 50 to 60 years, from affirmative action to Roe v. Wade, and now taking away the ability for the federal government to regulate things that should be regulated. We're not talking about regulating minor things. We're not talking about regulating a micromanaged individual citizen's life. It's not the conservative panic that, oh my God, they're going to be in our bedrooms, in our bathrooms, in our kitchens, in our wallets. No, this is saying if there's an oil spill and we don't have a clear law, the Environmental Protection Agency should decide how to proceed if there's a dispute. This makes complete sense, unless you have an agenda that goes beyond justice. If you have an agenda that goes beyond common sense, you have an agenda that goes beyond what works, because we got 40 years of legal doctrine that shows that it works. And it's only this court that has said we got to do something different. So no longer will lower courts defer to federal agencies when things aren't crystal clear. Now it's a mess. Now it's a mess. And courts that are deeply ideological, that are not following the principles that should be guiding them, instead, are going to be activist judges in all the ways that Republicans said they hate. But now that the activism is happening in a way that enhances and advances their mission and their values and undermines liberal or radical or progressive values, now all of a sudden they about that action. It is ridiculous. And it's also a reminder, I got to say this, y'all, and I know my third party brethren, and I'm a third party person, I'm a Green Party member. This is why it's important for us to think about, really think about what we're doing in this upcoming election. We have to think about closely and deeply what kind of outcome we want to have in November. Because if a Trump court becomes fortified because Trump gets reelected and he puts another judge on the bench, another Supreme Court judge on the bench, we may never see a liberal or even progressive or even non-fascist Supreme Court in our lifetime. We got to do something. And it means doing everything we can to ensure that Donald Trump is not the president in 2024. It is really that simple.